The afternoon sun blazed hot over Pine Creek, a small southern town nestled deep in the woods. Pine Creek was the kind of place where the air hung heavy with secrets, where people pretended not to see what they couldn't explain. And on this day, the secrets followed two men into the woods. Malcolm Wright's footsteps stumbled over roots and rocks, his breathing sharp as he was pushed forward by the rough hands of Deputy Ray Thornton. Ray's smirk widened with each step. Behind them, Officer Dale Simmons followed, twirling a thick coil of rope in his hand like a snake ready to strike. "Move faster, boy!" Ray spat, his southern drawl dripping with venom. Malcolm didn't answer. His wrists burned where the plastic zip ties dug into his skin. The sticky heat of the woods only added to the suffocation building in his chest. At 23, Malcolm was known as a quiet, hard-working young man. He worked as a mechanic at his uncle's garage. He minded his business. But that didn't matter to Ray or Simmons. They had stopped him near the corner store earlier that afternoon, accusing him of being involved in a robbery. No evidence, no questions, just suspicion. And suspicion, when paired with prejudice, was enough. Ray grabbed Malcolm's shoulder, forcing him to turn and face the officers. "You know why we're out here?" Malcolm's dark eyes met Ray's, calm but unwavering. "No, sir," he replied, his voice steady. "I don't." "You don't?" Ray's face twisted into a grin. "That's real funny. You think people like you just get away with everything?" Malcolm swallowed, forcing his anger down. He knew what they wanted, to see him snap, to see fear in his eyes. He wouldn't give them that. "Keep your mouth shut," Simmons barked, stepping forward. The rope uncoiled from his hands, and Malcolm's stomach twisted as he realized what was coming. Simmons grabbed his arm and shoved him backward until his back hit the rough bark of an old oak tree. "Hold still," Simmons muttered as he began tying Malcolm to the trunk. The rope dug into his chest, pulling tight, while Ray chuckled in the background. "Bet you're starting to feel real small right about now," Ray said, crouching down to meet Malcolm's gaze. "See, out here, nobody's going to hear you crying for help. This here is a lesson. People like you don't belong in places like Pine Creek. Not anymore." Malcolm clenched his teeth, his breath steady despite the fire in his chest. "What happens when someone finds out what you did?" he asked softly. Ray's grin faltered just slightly before he recovered. "Ain't nobody finding out anything. You'll be out here all night, learning respect. That's it. We're not killers." Simmons laughed as he pocketed Malcolm's phone. "No signal out here anyway." They stepped back, admiring their work as if Malcolm were nothing more than a prize buck strung up after the hunt. Then, without another word, they turned and walked back toward the road, leaving him alone in the quiet clearing. Malcolm listened to their footsteps fade, the distant crunch of gravel as they reached their car. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. The ropes were too tight, and the zip ties cut into his wrists. He tested them with a small movement, but they held firm. Above him, the trees swayed gently, their leaves rustling in whispers. For the first time, Malcolm noticed how still the woods felt. The air was heavy, and there was a faint buzz, almost like static, rolling through it. Then came the first crack of thunder. Malcolm's eyes shot open, his gaze darting upward. Dark clouds had gathered above the treetops, blotting out the sun. He hadn't noticed the storm rolling in. The wind picked up suddenly, whistling through the clearing, carrying with it the sharp scent of ozone. Back near their squad car, Ray leaned against the hood, lighting a cigarette. "Storm's coming in," Simmons muttered, glancing up at the sky. "Didn't hear about no storm on the radio." Ray shrugged. "Weather changes. It'll pass." But it didn't. Within minutes, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the ground. The wind howled louder, rattling the branches like bones. Thunder rolled again, closer now, deeper. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we ought to check on him. This ain't right." "Don't get soft on me now," Ray snapped, blowing smoke into the air. Then came a sound neither of them could ignore, a deafening crack of lightning, so close it shook the ground beneath their feet. They both froze. The woods, for a single heartbeat, went deathly silent. Simmons's face paled. "Ray, that hit close." Ray's cigarette fell from his lips as he straightened, his bravado slipping. "You don't think—" Another boom of thunder drowned out his words, followed by a loud, splintering crash. It came from the direction of the clearing. "God damn it," Simmons hissed. "We gotta go back." If that tree fell? Ray hesitated. He didn't want to go back. But he knew Simmons was right. If the kid got hurt, or worse, it'd be their heads. "Fine," he growled. "Let's go." The clearing was almost unrecognizable when they stumbled back through the woods. Rain pounded against the earth, soaking their uniforms. Simmons's flashlight flickered against the darkened trees, the beam shaking in his unsteady grip. "Malcolm!" Simmons shouted, his voice drowned out by the storm. They reached the oak tree and stopped dead. Malcolm was gone. The rope lay in a heap at the base of the trunk, singed and broken, as if struck by lightning. The bark was blackened, the smell of burning wood still lingering in the air. Ray's face went pale. "How?" Before Simmons could answer, a voice rose behind them. "You should have left me alone." They spun around, their flashlights swinging wildly. Malcolm stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, rain dripping from his soaked clothes, his expression unreadable. "Malcolm," Simmons stammered, his voice cracking. We didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to what?" Malcolm's voice was low, but it cut through the storm like a blade. "You didn't mean to leave me out here to die? Or you didn't mean to get caught?" Ray took a step back, his boots slipping in the mud. "Now, son, listen. It was just a joke, just a lesson." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Your lesson just backfired." Thunder roared overhead, louder than before, and the wind howled like a living thing. Ray's flashlight flickered and died. "Please," Simmons choked, his voice barely a whisper now. "We're sorry." Malcolm said nothing. He stood still, his silhouette barely visible through the driving rain. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared back into the storm. Ray and Simmons were left standing in the clearing, soaked, shivering, and begging for mercy in the face of something they couldn't understand. Ray Thornton sat stiffly on the edge of his couch, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. It was his fourth attempt, and the lighter slipped out of his fingers again, clattering onto the coffee table. The storm had passed hours ago, but in Ray's mind, the sound of thunder still rumbled like an echo, shaking him to his core. Across town, Dale Simmons sat at his own kitchen table, staring into a cup of cold coffee that he hadn't touched. His hands trembled, his shirt still damp from the rain. The smell of burnt wood lingered in his nostrils, and every flash of light through his window made him jump. They hadn't spoken to each other since they got back to the squad car and sped out of the woods. They didn't call it in, didn't report anything. They couldn't. Because how could they explain it? Malcolm Wright had been tied to that tree, impossible to escape. But when they returned, the rope was burned through, the bark scorched, and Malcolm had been standing there, staring at them like something beyond human. The kid didn't fight them, didn't raise a hand. He just stood there, his voice calm, but cutting like a blade. Ray shivered, cursing under his breath as he finally lit his cigarette. He inhaled deeply, hoping to quiet his nerves. He told himself it didn't matter. So what if the kid got loose? He wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't dare. Malcolm was a nobody. Ray just had to keep his head down, and the whole thing would blow over. That's what he told himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something was watching him. The next morning, Pine Creek woke up to clear skies and the smell of rain-soaked earth. It was a peaceful day for most, but not for Ray or Simmons. Ray pulled into the station's parking lot, his sunglasses hiding the dark circles beneath his eyes. He stepped out of the car and glanced around uneasily before heading inside. Simmons was already there, sitting at his desk, his face pale. "You look like hell," Ray muttered, dropping into his chair. Simmons didn't respond. He just stared at the cup of coffee in front of him. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. "What happened yesterday, Ray?" Ray stiffened. "Nothing happened." Simmons looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You saw what I saw. That rope, that tree." "It's nothing," Ray snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "It was lightning, a freak accident. And the kid? He got lucky. That's all." Simmons shook his head. "No, you felt it, didn't you? When we saw him, when he was just standing there, it felt wrong, like—" He paused, struggling to find the words. Like something bigger was happening. Ray slammed his hand down on the desk, making Simmons flinch. "Shut up about it. You hear me? You don't say another word to anyone." He leaned closer, his voice a low hiss. "If anyone finds out we tied that kid to a tree, we're finished. You understand? Fired, arrested, hell, maybe worse. So you keep your mouth shut." Simmons looked away, his face pale, but he nodded slowly. That same morning, Malcolm Wright stood in front of the garage, wiping oil from his hands as he watched the cars roll down Main Street. He hadn't slept much either, but his face didn't betray it. He was calm, almost eerily so. His uncle, Jim Wright, leaned against the garage door with a concerned expression. "You sure you're all right, boy?" Jim asked, his deep voice filled with worry. "I'm fine, Uncle Jim," Malcolm replied, forcing a small smile. Jim studied him for a long moment. "You didn't come home last night. Where were you?" Malcolm hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "Out in the woods. Got caught in that storm." Jim's eyes narrowed. "Out in the woods, huh? That all?" Malcolm didn't answer. He just nodded and turned back to the car he was working on. Jim stared at him for a few seconds longer, then sighed. "You tell me if something's wrong, you hear? Ain't nothing worth keeping quiet about." "Yes, sir," Malcolm said softly, though he knew he wouldn't tell Jim anything. Because Malcolm had felt it too. The storm, the lightning, the unexplainable power that had crackled through the clearing. He had felt it wrap around him, had felt the ropes burn away like paper. When he looked at Ray and Simmons afterward, he didn't see men anymore. He saw cowards. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm felt something shift deep in his chest. He wasn't afraid of them anymore. By noon, Pine Creek was buzzing with rumors. "Did you hear about the lightning storm last night? Knocked out a tree in the pines. Some folks said they heard screaming. Sheriff Collins says the deputies were out there late. Wonder what they were doing." Ray heard the whispers as he walked into the diner for lunch. He felt every set of eyes on him, and for a moment, he swore someone was laughing. But when he turned to look, the sound was gone. He sat down at the counter and ordered coffee, his hands still unsteady. He told himself it was all in his head, but as he sipped the bitter drink, the bell above the door chimed, and he glanced up instinctively. Malcolm Wright had just walked in. Ray froze. Malcolm didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He just walked calmly to the other end of the counter, greeted the waitress with a smile, and took a seat. The whole diner went silent, tension rippling through the room like a current. Ray clenched his fists beneath the table, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't look away. Malcolm finally turned his head and met Ray's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only calm. But somehow, that was worse. Ray dropped a few crumpled bills on the counter and stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't say a word as he stormed out of the diner, the sound of Malcolm's soft "good morning" following him like a ghost. That night, Ray sat alone in his darkened living room, his gun on the coffee table in front of him. The events of the last 24 hours replayed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Suddenly, there was a sound outside, a soft knock on the door. Ray jolted upright, his heart leaping into his throat. He grabbed the gun with trembling hands and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice shaking. Silence. Ray swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his brow. He inched closer and peeked through the window. No one was there, but as he turned away, a voice echoed softly from the darkness outside. "You should have left me alone." Ray froze, his blood running cold. He spun back toward the door, throwing it open and pointing his gun into the night. But there was no one there, only the empty street and the rustle of the wind. Ray's hands shook violently as he backed into the house and slammed the door shut. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again, and Ray realized the storm wasn't over. The morning sun rose bright over Pine Creek, but it brought no comfort to Ray Thornton. His night had been restless, haunted by Malcolm's voice. "You should have left me alone." The words echoed in his head, like a whisper coming from every shadow. He hadn't slept. Instead, he sat by the door with his gun in his lap, jumping at every creak of the house. Ray arrived at the station 2 hours early, sweat still slick on his brow. The fluorescent lights of the squad room buzzed faintly, drilling into his skull. He dumped himself into his chair, ignoring the side-eye glances of his colleagues. Simmons walked in soon after, looking no better. His face was pale, his uniform wrinkled like he hadn't bothered to change from yesterday. He glanced at Ray, his eyes hollow, before dropping into the chair beside him. "You didn't sleep either," Simmons muttered. Ray rubbed his face with his hands, his voice low. "Something's wrong, Dale. I don't know what it is, but it's wrong. I heard him last night." Simmons's head snapped up. "What?" "Malcolm," Ray said, swallowing hard. "He was outside my house. I heard him clear as day, but when I looked, no one was there." Simmons paled further, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Ray, I think we messed with something we shouldn't have." Ray glared at him. "Don't start that again." "I'm serious," Simmons hissed, his voice sharp. "That storm, it wasn't normal. You know it wasn't. And what happened in those woods? I don't know how to explain it, but Malcolm shouldn't have been able to walk away. You saw that rope. It burned. It wasn't just lightning, Ray. I'm telling you, something's not right." Ray's lip curled, anger flaring in his chest. "You need to shut up about this, you hear me? We're not going to say a damn word to anyone. You start talking crazy, and we're done for." Simmons shook his head slowly, as though trying to shake off his rising panic. He didn't argue, but Ray could see it in his eyes. The fear was taking root, spreading like poison. Across town, Malcolm stood outside the garage, watching the street in silence. His uncle, Jim Wright, walked up behind him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've been awful quiet, boy," Jim said softly. "Something happened to you in them woods, didn't it?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He stared at the road, his face calm, unreadable. "I don't know what happened, Uncle Jim," he said finally. "I just know. It's not over." Jim frowned, his dark eyes narrowing. "What ain't over?" Malcolm turned to face him. "They're scared now." Jim's expression darkened. "Who's scared? Them deputies?" Malcolm nodded. "They thought they could do what they wanted and walk away. But now they're the ones looking over their shoulders, and they should be." Jim let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Listen to me, Malcolm. I know you're angry, but don't go down this road. I've been there myself, and I know where it leads. Revenge don't heal nothing." Malcolm met his uncle's gaze. "I'm not looking for revenge." Jim studied him for a long moment, searching for something in Malcolm's face. Whatever he saw there made him step back slightly. "You be careful, boy. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," Malcolm said quietly, though his words carried a weight that Jim couldn't quite place. Later that afternoon, Ray and Simmons found themselves driving out to the Pines. Neither of them wanted to be there, but neither could resist the pull. It was as though the clearing where Malcolm had been tied was calling them back. "I don't know why we're doing this," Simmons grumbled as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. "We need to see it again," Ray replied, though he didn't sound convinced himself. "We need to prove to ourselves that it was just a storm. That's all." They parked at the edge of the woods, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The air felt heavier here, like the storm had left something behind. The two men stepped out of the car, their boots crunching on the gravel as they moved toward the tree line. "Let's get this over with," Simmons muttered, his hand brushing against his holstered gun. The forest was quieter than it should have been. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves and the distant creak of branches swaying. Simmons swallowed hard. "Ray, something ain't right." Ray didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the clearing up ahead. When they reached it, they both stopped short. The tree was still there, blackened and scarred where the lightning had struck. The rope lay in a heap at its base, frayed and burned, just as they'd left it. But now, something else was there too. Carved into the bark of the tree were words, deep, jagged letters that hadn't been there before. "You should have left me alone." Simmons let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back. "Ray, what the hell is that?" Ray felt his blood turn to ice. "It's a trick," he said, though his voice shook. "Someone's messing with us. That kid, he must have come back out here and done this." Simmons' voice was rising, panic threatening to consume him. "How, Ray? How would he do this? The bark's burned like the rope. This ain't normal." Ray spun around, grabbing Simmons by the shoulder. "Get a hold of yourself," he barked. "It's just a damn prank, that's all. Don't lose your head now." But Simmons wasn't listening. He was staring past Ray, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Ray," Simmons whispered. Ray turned slowly, following Simmons's gaze. Malcolm stood at the edge of the clearing. He was far enough away that they couldn't see his expression, but his posture was unnerving, still and calm, like he was watching them. Ray's throat went dry. "What the hell?" Malcolm didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his silhouette outlined by the fading afternoon light filtering through the trees. "Ray, let's get out of here," Simmons choked out. "Let's go." Ray didn't argue. They turned and ran, stumbling through the underbrush like frightened children, branches snapping underfoot. Neither of them looked back to see if Malcolm was still there. When they reached the car, Simmons fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. "Hurry up!" Ray shouted, his voice raw with fear. Finally, Simmons got the car started, and they tore out of the woods, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as they sped down the narrow road. Neither of them spoke on the drive back. They didn't dare. But as Ray stared out the window, his pulse still racing, one thought clawed its way to the front of his mind. This isn't over. The next morning in Pine Creek was as quiet as a graveyard. The sun hung lazily in the sky, indifferent to the unease that had started to seep through the town like a slow poison. At the sheriff's station, Ray Thornton sat at his desk, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. He hadn't been able to sleep after the encounter in the woods. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words carved into the tree, "You should have left me alone." Every time he thought about it, he felt something crawling under his skin, a prickling dread he couldn't shake. Across the room, Simmons wasn't faring much better. He was hunched over at his desk, staring blankly at his coffee. Neither man spoke to each other. They didn't need to. Their fear was shared, hanging between them like a dark cloud. Sheriff Collins, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a sharp gaze, strode into the station and paused. He narrowed his eyes as he looked at the two deputies. "What's wrong with you boys?" Ray sat up straighter, trying to pull himself together. "Nothing, Sheriff, just a long night." Collins gave him a skeptical look. "Uh-huh. Well, you better get your head straight. The mayor's been on me about that robbery case from the other day. Says you two were the first on scene and haven't filed a full report yet." Simmons looked up sharply, his face pale. We're working on it, sir." "Work faster," Collins snapped. "I don't need the mayor breathing down my neck about unsolved cases." He gave them one last glance before disappearing into his office, leaving Ray and Simmons alone again. Simmons leaned over, his voice low. "Ray, We gotta tell him. We can't keep this up. Ray shot him a look that could have burned through steel. Don't even think about it. You think anyone's gonna believe us? We say one word about Malcolm, the woods, or that damn tree, and we're done. You want to go to prison? Simmons swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. No, but this isn't right. He's doing something to us, Ray. I can feel it. Ray stood up abruptly, grabbing his hat off the desk. You're losing your mind. I'm going out on patrol. You sit here and stew in your paranoia if you want. He didn't wait for a response before storming out of the station and slamming the door behind him. Meanwhile, at the garage, Malcolm worked in silence. He had his hands buried under the hood of a pickup truck, the hum of the engine and the faint clang of tools keeping him grounded. But even here, in the place where he felt safest, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was still with him. It wasn't in the sky anymore. It was inside him, simmering quietly. The bell above the garage door jingled, and Malcolm wiped his hands on a rag as he turned to see his uncle, Jim Wright, walking in. "You're still at it, huh?" Jim said, crossing his arms as he surveyed the truck. "Work doesn't stop," Malcolm replied with a faint smile. Jim didn't smile back. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I just got off the phone with Pastor Green. He says word's been going around town that something strange happened in the pines. People saying they heard screams during that storm." Malcolm's hands froze on the wrench he was holding. "I don't know anything about that." Jim studied him carefully. "You sure? Because it's not like you to come home soaking wet in the middle of the night and say nothing about it. And I know you, boy. You ain't been the same since." Malcolm set the wrench down and turned to face his uncle. His voice was calm, steady. "I didn't ask for any of this, Uncle Jim, but I'm not running anymore. Not from them." Jim sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Malcolm, I know you think you're standing up for yourself, but sometimes walking away is the stronger choice." "Not this time," Malcolm said firmly. "They need to understand they can't treat people like this and just walk away." Jim opened his mouth to argue, but the sharp blast of a car horn outside cut him off. They both turned to see a police cruiser idling across the street, the engine running. Ray sat behind the wheel, his sunglasses on, staring directly at Malcolm through the windshield. "Go on back to work," Jim muttered, his voice tight. "I'll deal with this." Malcolm didn't move, his eyes locked on the cruiser. "He's here for me, Uncle Jim. Not you." Jim glanced at him, then let out a resigned sigh. "Be careful, boy." Ray didn't know why he'd come here. He told himself it was just a patrol, but deep down, he knew better. Something about Malcolm's calm stare in the woods, the way he seemed unshaken by what they had done, it haunted Ray. He needed to remind himself that Malcolm was just a man, nothing more. But as he sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the garage, he saw Malcolm step out onto the sidewalk. Malcolm stood there, his posture relaxed, his hands in his pockets, but his eyes locked on Ray. Ray felt his stomach twist. That look, it was the same calm, steady gaze Malcolm had given him in the woods. It was like Malcolm could see right through him. Ray's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He rolled down the window, trying to keep his voice steady. "What are you looking at, boy?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He just stared for a moment longer before saying softly, "You scared, Deputy?" Ray flinched, though he tried to hide it. "You better watch your mouth." "I don't have to do anything," Malcolm replied. "But you're running, aren't you? You're looking over your shoulder because you know what you did." Ray's pulse pounded in his ears. "You shut your damn mouth." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curving up in a faint smile. "You're not in charge anymore, Deputy. The storm didn't just pass. It changed things. And you know it." Ray felt his breath catch, an icy hand closing around his chest. He slammed the car into gear and sped off, leaving Malcolm standing there in the rearview mirror, calm as ever. That night, the nightmare began again. Ray lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows on the walls dancing like ghosts. Outside, The wind picked up, rattling the window panes. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but as soon as he did, he heard it again. A voice, low and steady, coming from the darkness outside. "You should have left me alone." Ray shot up in bed, his heart racing. He grabbed the gun from his nightstand and stumbled to the window, throwing it open. The yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But as he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. Carved into the dirt below his window were the same words, "You should have left me alone." Ray staggered back, his pulse thundering in his ears. He turned and ran for the front door, desperate to escape the walls closing in around him. But when he threw open the door, he froze. Standing at the edge of the yard was a figure. Malcolm. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at Ray, the wind howling around him. Ray's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, the gun slipping from his trembling fingers. "Please," Ray choked out, his voice barely audible. "Please." Malcolm didn't say a word, and then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. Ray was left alone in the dark, the wind carrying the faint echo of thunder in the distance. Ray Thornton sat in his patrol car, drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. His trembling hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The sun had barely begun to rise, and Pine Creek's streets were still quiet. But Ray couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He hadn't slept. Not after last night. Not after seeing Malcolm. Ray had spent the rest of the night pacing his living room, gun in hand, every shadow in the house seeming to crawl toward him. And then there were those words, carved into the dirt outside his window like a curse. "You should have left me alone." It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't a coincidence. Malcolm Wright was coming for him. Ray reached for the radio, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button. "Base, this is Unit 14. I'm reporting in early, requesting a meeting with Sheriff Collins." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Unit 14. Sheriff's not in yet. Should be here around 8. Everything all right, Thornton?" Ray hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he thought about telling the truth. But what would he say? That he'd left a man tied to a tree, and now that man was haunting him? No one would believe it. "Yeah," Ray muttered finally. "Just couldn't sleep. I'll be patrolling Maine." He turned off the radio and ran a shaking hand through his hair. He didn't know what he was going to do. But one thing was clear. He had to stop Malcolm before things got worse. Across town, Dale Simmons wasn't doing much better. He sat in his kitchen, staring blankly at the clock as it ticked. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of another sleepless night. He hadn't seen Malcolm at his window like Ray had, but he felt the same suffocating fear gnawing at his insides. It was like something had crawled into his soul and refused to let go. The nightmares were the worst. Every time Simmons closed his eyes, he was back in the woods, standing in front of that tree. The rope burned, the bark scorched, Malcolm's calm face staring back at him through the storm. The whispers followed him out of the dream. "You should have left me alone." A sudden knock on the front door jolted Simmons out of his daze. His heart leapt into his throat, and for a second he thought it was Malcolm. But when he peered through the window, he let out a shaky breath. It was Sheriff Collins. At the sheriff's station, Ray was surprised to see Simmons walk in behind Collins. Simmons looked like hell, paler than before, his uniform wrinkled and damp with sweat. Collins led them both into his office, shutting the door behind them. "All right, you two," the sheriff said, lowering himself into his chair. "I don't know what's going on, but it's time to come clean." Ray shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean, sir?" Collins narrowed his eyes. "You've both been acting strange, not filing reports, jumping at shadows. Half the town says they heard screaming during that storm the other night. And someone's been talking about burned-up trees in the pines. I want answers, and I want them now." Ray opened his mouth to protest, but Simmons spoke first. "Sheriff, it's about Malcolm Wright." Ray snapped his head toward him, his face contorting with fury. "Simmons, shut up!" "No, Ray!" Simmons shouted, his voice cracking. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend nothing happened." Collins leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What happened with Malcolm Wright?" Simmons swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. "It was us. We took him into the pines. We tied him to a tree during that storm." Collins froze. His expression shifted slowly, disbelief turning into anger. "You did what?" "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious," Ray interjected, desperation seeping into his voice. "We just wanted to scare him a little, that's all. But the storm hit, and something happened." Collins stared at them both, his jaw tight. "You mean to tell me you two idiots tied that boy to a tree and left him there during a damn lightning storm?" Neither man said anything. Collins ran a hand down his face, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you realize what you've done? That boy could have died. Hell, maybe he should have died, but instead, he's out there, and now you've got half the town whispering about strange things in the pines." Simmons' voice broke as he whispered, "He's coming for us, Sheriff. I can feel it." Collins scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake, you two are scared of your own shadows. You think Malcolm Wright is out here haunting you like a ghost? Grow up." He pointed at both of them, his face red with fury. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to find Malcolm Wright, and you're going to make this right. Apologize. Do whatever it takes. Because if word gets out about what you did, I'll make damn sure you both end up in prison where you belong. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," they mumbled, shame washing over them. But as Ray sat there, his mind spinning, he couldn't help but wonder, what if making it right was no longer an option? That afternoon, Ray and Simmons drove to the garage. The sun blazed overhead, the sky a blinding blue, but neither of them felt its warmth. Ray's hands were clammy on the wheel as they pulled up across the street. "There he is," Simmons said, nodding toward Malcolm, who stood by the garage doors talking to a customer. Ray's stomach twisted. Malcolm looked calm, unbothered, like he had nothing to fear. "You think he'll talk to us?" Simmons whispered. Ray gritted his teeth. "We're not asking. We're telling him." They stepped out of the car and crossed the street. Malcolm looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "Malcolm," Ray said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to talk." Malcolm looked between the two of them. "About what?" Ray swallowed. "About the other night." For a moment, Malcolm said nothing. Then he set his tools down, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked Ray in the eyes. "You want to talk? Fine, let's talk." In the back of the garage, the three men stood in the shadow of the building. The air felt heavy, like the calm before another storm. "What do you want, Deputy?" Malcolm asked quietly. Ray glanced at Simmons, then back at Malcolm. "Look, we shouldn't have done what we did. It was wrong." Simmons nodded, his voice shaking. We're sorry, Malcolm. It got out of hand." Malcolm stared at them, his dark eyes piercing. "Sorry?" he repeated softly. "You think saying sorry changes what you did?" Ray's jaw clenched. "We're just trying to make this right, all right? What do you want from us?" Malcolm took a step forward, and for the first time, Ray felt truly small. "You want to make this right?" Malcolm said, his voice cold as steel. "Then tell the truth. Tell everyone in this town what you did to me." Ray's heart pounded. "We can't do that. Then we have nothing to talk about." Malcolm turned and walked back toward the garage, leaving Ray and Simmons standing there in silence, their fear bubbling up like poison. Ray watched him go, his fists clenching at his sides. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to himself than to Simmons. Simmons glanced at him nervously. "What are you going to do?" Ray's eyes darkened. "Whatever I have to." That night, the wind picked up again. Malcolm sat alone in his uncle's living room, staring out the window as the trees swayed in the darkness. He could feel it. The storm wasn't done. Not yet, and neither was he. The pines were waiting for them. Ray Thornton gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car, his face rigid as he drove down the dark back road leading to the clearing. Simmons sat beside him, pale and silent, his hands shaking in his lap. The headlights sliced through the blackness, but it felt like the darkness was swallowing everything whole. Ray's voice broke the silence. "You're gonna stop whining about this, Simmons. We're gonna handle him tonight." Simmons didn't answer right away. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Ray, what if we're wrong?" "Wrong about what?" "About him," Simmons said shakily, his eyes darting to the window, as though something might be staring back. "What if he's not just a man anymore?" Ray's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Don't start that nonsense again. He's just a kid with a grudge. You're letting your imagination get the best of you." But even as Ray said the words, he didn't believe them. Not fully. Not after the words carved into the dirt outside his house. Not after seeing Malcolm standing beneath the moonlight as if the storm itself had followed him. Ray's mind was unraveling, and he could feel it, like something twisting deeper and deeper inside him, eating him from the inside out. Malcolm Wright stood alone in the clearing, the forest stretched out around him, quiet and still. But Malcolm could feel it, the hum in the air, the energy that seemed to ripple beneath the ground. The storm wasn't done yet. His chest rose and fell slowly, his breaths even, his body calm. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. Malcolm turned his head slightly, watching the two approaching beams of light. They cut through the darkness, but seemed dimmer as they neared the clearing, like the pines themselves were swallowing the light. The patrol car stopped, the engine ticking as it cooled. Ray and Simmons stepped out, their flashlights flickering weakly in their hands. The beams of light wavered, as though the air itself resisted their presence. "There he is," Simmons croaked. Malcolm turned to face them, his silhouette framed by the massive oak tree where they had left him to die. His expression was unreadable, his calm gaze locking onto Ray. Ray's voice came out louder than he intended, shaking with something he couldn't hide. "You shouldn't be here." Malcolm didn't move. "You brought me here, Deputy." Ray's hand went to his holstered gun instinctively. "We're not playing your games anymore, boy. You want to stand there and act tough? Go ahead. But this ends tonight." The wind stirred around them, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone, the promise of rain. Simmons shifted uncomfortably, his voice trembling. "Ray, let's just go. Let's get out of here." Ray whipped his head toward Simmons, his face twisted with anger. "Shut up, Dale. I'm handling this." He turned back to Malcolm. "I don't know what you've been doing to us, following me, whispering outside my house, but it ends now. You understand me?" Malcolm took a single step forward. The air crackled faintly, as though the woods were holding their breath. "I didn't follow you, Deputy," Malcolm said softly. "I don't need to." Ray's pulse pounded in his ears. He gripped the gun at his side, his hands slick with sweat. "You're gonna stop this, whatever it is you're doing, or I swear—" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his voice cold but steady. "Or what? You'll tie me to a tree again. Leave me to die?" Ray froze. Simmons let out a shaky breath, taking a step backward. "You don't understand, do you?" Malcolm continued, his voice soft yet carrying through the clearing like thunder. "You think you're still in control. You think you can scare me like you did before." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But you're the ones who are scared now." The wind picked up suddenly, roaring through the trees like a living thing. The flashlights flickered in their hands. Simmons turned, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Ray, I don't want to be here anymore." "Shut up, Dale!" Ray shouted, but his voice cracked. He turned his attention back to Malcolm, his panic boiling over. "Enough of this." He drew his gun, pointing it directly at Malcolm. "You take one more step, and I'll drop you where you stand." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. Ray's hand shook, his finger hovering over the trigger. "I swear to God, you think that's going to save you?" Malcolm's voice cut through the wind like a knife. The air seemed to split open with the sound of a deep crack of thunder. The wind howled around them, whipping leaves and dirt into the air. Simmons shouted in terror as the flashlights went dark, plunging the clearing into pitch blackness. "Ray!" Simmons screamed. "What's happening?" Ray spun wildly, his gun trembling as he pointed it into the darkness. "Where is he? Where is he?" Malcolm's voice echoed through the clearing, calm and terrifying. "You can't outrun it. You can't hide from it. The storm follows you because you made it." The ground seemed to hum beneath their feet, vibrating with energy. Simmons stumbled back, falling to the dirt as he clutched his head. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," he wailed. Ray turned, the gun still raised, his breathing ragged. "Show yourself, you coward!" A flash of lightning lit up the clearing for a split second, and Ray saw him, Malcolm, standing beneath the oak tree, calm and still as though he had been there the whole time. Ray fired, once, twice, 3 times. The gunshots echoed through the woods, but when the light faded, Malcolm was gone. Ray's gun fell from his hand, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground, gasping for breath. The wind died down slowly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Simmons sat a few feet away, his face buried in his hands, his body trembling. "Ray," he whispered hoarsely, "we shouldn't have done it. We shouldn't have done any of it." Ray didn't respond. He stared at the blackened tree, his eyes wide with terror. Because carved deep into the bark, the words were there again, fresh and unmistakable. "You should have left me alone." The storm was gone, but Ray knew it would be back. The woods weren't done with them yet, and neither was Malcolm Wright. Ray Thornton sat at his kitchen table, a whiskey bottle in front of him, its amber contents nearly gone. His hands shook as he poured another glass, the liquid sloshing over the edge. Outside, Pine Creek was silent. Too silent. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The events in the pines haunted him. The gunshots, the flashes of Malcolm standing beneath the oak tree, the wind roaring as if the storm had a voice of its own. He couldn't explain any of it. No matter how many times he told himself it wasn't real, his mind knew the truth. Malcolm Wright wasn't like anyone Ray had ever crossed before. "You're losing it," he muttered to himself, downing the whiskey in one gulp. But even as he said it, Ray knew he wasn't the only one falling apart. Simmons hadn't shown up at the station that morning. No calls, no sign of him. Ray had driven by Simmons' house earlier, pounding on the door until his fists hurt, but there was no answer. Simmons' cruiser was still parked in the driveway, the windows fogged up. Something was wrong, and Ray knew it. As he sat in the silence, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Ray's blood ran cold as he felt it again, that feeling of being watched. Slowly, he turned toward the window. The curtains swayed faintly, but through the thin fabric, Ray thought he saw something. A shadow, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. Ray jumped to his feet, the chair scraping loudly across the floor. He grabbed the gun from the counter and stormed toward the window, throwing the curtains open. But there was nothing there, only the empty yard, bathed in pale moonlight. Ray stumbled back, sweat dripping down his face. His breathing was ragged as he muttered to himself, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not—" A knock at the door cut him off. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Ray froze. His pulse pounded in his ears. He gripped the gun tightly, moving toward the door. "Who's there?" he called, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. Silence. He swallowed hard, gripping the doorknob. Slowly, he turned it and pulled the door open. The porch was empty. Ray stepped out, his gun shaking in his hand as he scanned the yard. "Who's out here?" he shouted into the night. "Show yourself!" A faint breeze whispered through the trees, carrying a sound with it. A voice, low and familiar. "You can't hide, deputy." Ray spun toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, and the faint creak of branches swaying in the wind. Across town, Dale Simmons sat curled up on the floor of his living room. His house was dark, the curtains drawn tight, the front door locked and barricaded with furniture. His hands were pressed over his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were still there. They slithered through the walls, seeping in like smoke. Simmons could hear Malcolm's voice, soft and steady, repeating the same words over and over. "You should have left me alone." Simmons rocked back and forth, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until Simmons couldn't tell if the voice was in his head or inside the house with him. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone off the floor and dialed. Come on," he muttered as it rang. Finally, someone picked up. "Hello? Sheriff Collins?" Simmons stammered, his voice trembling. "Dale, that you?" Collins' voice was gruff, half asleep. "What the hell's going on?" "Sheriff, you gotta help me," Simmons choked out. "He's coming for me. I know it. I can hear him in my house." "Who's coming for you?" "Malcolm!" Simmons shouted, his voice breaking. "We shouldn't have done it. We shouldn't—" A sharp click ended the call. Simmons stared at the phone, his breath catching in his throat. The line had gone dead, and then, from the darkness of the hallway, a soft voice whispered, "I told you I'd find you." Simmons' scream echoed through the house. The next morning, Sheriff Collins walked into the station with a deep frown on his face. He hadn't been able to shake the call from Simmons the night before. The man had sounded like he was on the edge of losing his mind. Collins walked to his office, glancing around the nearly empty station. "Where the hell are Thornton and Simmons?" he muttered. He grabbed the phone on his desk and dialed Simmons' number. No answer. He tried Ray next. Nothing. Grabbing his keys, Collins headed out to his cruiser. Whatever was going on with his deputies, he was going to get to the bottom of it. Simmons's house was quiet when Collins arrived. The curtains were drawn, and the front door was still barricaded. Collins knocked loudly, calling out, "Dale, open up! It's the sheriff!" No answer. With a grunt, Collins stepped back and kicked the door in, the lock splintering with a sharp crack. The house was dark and silent, the air heavy with something Collins couldn't quite place. "Simmons?" Collins called as he moved through the living room. His boot hit something. He looked down. The phone lay on the floor, the screen shattered. Collins's pulse quickened as he stepped further into the house. He could see the faint outline of Simmons' body sitting against the wall, slumped forward. "Dale?" Collins whispered. He moved closer, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. And then he saw it, carved into the wall above Simmons's lifeless body. The words burned deep into the wood. "You should have left me alone." Collins stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. He stared at the words, his mind racing. What the hell is going on? The sound of a door creaking made him spin around, his hand flying to his gun. The back door was open, swinging softly in the wind. For a moment, Collins thought he saw something, a shadow standing just beyond the yard, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone. Collins turned back to the lifeless body of Dale Simmons. He ran a hand down his face, his breath shaky. He didn't know what was happening in Pine Creek, but one thing was clear. It wasn't over, and whatever had started in those woods was coming for them all. The morning sun hung low over Pine Creek, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The town stirred uneasily, whispers and rumors spreading like wildfire after Sheriff Collins' discovery of Simmons' lifeless body. The words carved into Simmons' walls, "You should have left me alone," had already reached too many ears. People spoke in hushed tones about curses, storms, and the two deputies who seemed to have lost their grip on sanity. Sheriff Collins didn't believe in ghosts or curses, But something unnatural was unfolding in his town, and it all led back to the Pines and to Malcolm Wright. Ray Thornton sat on the floor of his living room, his gun resting beside him. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His house was dark, curtains drawn tight, as though shutting out the light could keep the truth at bay. But no matter how much Ray tried to block it out, it clawed its way into his mind. Simmons was dead, and now the storm, the one that followed Malcolm Wright, was coming for him. He could still hear Malcolm's voice from the clearing, calm and steady, yet terrifying in its power. "Tell the truth." Ray ran a shaking hand through his hair. He thought he could bury it all, what they did to Malcolm, the storm, the shame. But now it was eating him alive, and somewhere deep down, Ray knew the only way to stop it was to face it. He grabbed the gun and staggered to his feet. He couldn't keep running. He had to end it. Malcolm Wright stood at the edge of the garage staring at the tree line. The air was still, heavy with something unspoken. His uncle, Jim Wright, approached him cautiously, his deep voice soft. "You feel it, don't you?" Jim asked. Malcolm nodded slowly. "It's not over yet." Jim studied his nephew for a long moment. "What are you going to do, Malcolm?" Malcolm turned to face him, his gaze calm but unyielding. "I'm going to let him decide, Uncle Jim." "Decide what?" "If he tells the truth, it ends. If he doesn't, the storm comes back." Jim sighed, shaking his head. "That boy's already lost. Don't let this take you with him, Malcolm. You ain't got nothing to prove." Malcolm looked back at the woods. "It's not about proving anything. It's about finishing it." At the sheriff's station, Sheriff Collins paced in his office, his frustration boiling over. He'd been trying to reach Ray all morning, but the deputy wasn't answering. After what happened to Simmons, Collins couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Both men had been unraveling ever since that storm. When Collins turned to grab his keys, the door to his office burst open. Ray Thornton stood there, disheveled and pale, his eyes hollow. His voice was hoarse. "Sheriff, I need to talk." Collins froze. "Ray, what the hell's going on with you?" Ray stepped inside, his hands trembling at his sides. "It's Malcolm Wright," he muttered. "I need to tell you everything." Collins' eyes narrowed. "Go on." Ray's voice cracked as he spoke. "That night in the Pines, Simmons and we took Malcolm out there. We accused him of something he didn't do, and we tied him to a tree. We left him there in the storm. We thought—" Ray swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We thought he'd die out there." Collins stared at him in stunned silence. "You did what?" Ray broke, his hands covering his face. "I didn't mean for it to get this far, Sheriff. I didn't think it would come back to us." Collins's voice was cold as steel. "And Simmons, his death? That boy's blood ain't on his hands, Ray. It's on yours." Ray looked up, his face soaked with sweat. "I'll go to the town, Sheriff. I'll tell everyone what I did. I swear, I just wanted to stop." Collins took a long, hard look at the broken man in front of him. "You're damn right you're gonna tell everyone." By afternoon, word had spread that Deputy Ray Thornton was calling a town meeting at the steps of the courthouse. People gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The story had been simmering beneath the surface, whispers of the Pines, the storm, and the truth about Malcolm Wright. Malcolm stood near the back of the crowd, his face unreadable. His Uncle Jim was beside him, watching carefully. "You sure about this?" Jim whispered. Malcolm nodded. "It's his choice now." Ray Thornton stepped up to the steps of the courthouse, his hands shaking, his face pale. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with tension. Ray cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he began to speak. "2 nights ago, me and Simmons." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground before he forced himself to look at the crowd. "We took Malcolm Wright into the woods. We tied him to a tree during that storm, and left him there. We thought no one would care." A gasp rippled through the crowd. People exchanged horrified glances, and voices began to rise. Ray's voice cracked. "It wasn't right. Nothing about it was right. Malcolm didn't do anything wrong. I was just angry and scared. And now Simmons is dead. And I—" Ray faltered, his knees buckling slightly. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did." The crowd murmured loudly, outrage building. Sheriff Collins stepped forward, his voice booming. "Quiet! Let him finish!" Ray turned to face the crowd again, tears streaming down his face. "I don't expect forgiveness, but you all deserve to know the truth. And Malcolm—" Ray's gaze found him at the back of the crowd, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." The crowd turned to look at Malcolm, a hush falling over them. Malcolm didn't move, his expression calm but solemn. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had finally been spoken, and it was enough. That night, the storm didn't come back. Malcolm sat on his uncle's porch, the crickets chirping softly in the warm summer night. Jim sat beside him, letting out a long breath. "You did it," Jim said quietly. "It's over now." Malcolm looked up at the sky, clear and filled with stars. "It's not over for them. It's just starting." Jim frowned. "What do you mean?" Malcolm's gaze stayed on the horizon. "They'll have to live with it, the shame, the truth. And that's their storm to carry now." Jim studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're a good man, Malcolm. Don't let nobody take that from you." Malcolm didn't answer. He just watched the stars, the weight on his chest finally lifting. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, Pine Creek felt quiet. Epilogue. Days turned to weeks, and the town began to heal, though the scars remained. Deputy Ray Thornton resigned and left Pine Creek, a broken man. Sheriff Collins made sure an investigation into Simmons's and Ray's actions was launched, though everyone already knew the truth. As for Malcolm Wright, he stayed in Pine Creek, working at his uncle's garage, his head held high. People looked at him differently now, not with pity, but with respect. He had survived. He had faced the storm and come out stronger. The pines were quiet again. And Malcolm knew that sometimes the loudest reckonings weren't the storms you could see, but the ones you carried inside.